Hello, I'm Juliet Mann, and this is the Agenda podcast, CGTN Europe's one-stop shop for smart, in-depth discussion of the issues that really matter in the world today. Over the next 30 years, the number of people aged over 80 will triple to 420 million. So what will that mean for society and for the global economy? Here at the World Economic Forum Growth Summit 2023, I spoke to Christian Keller, Chief Economist of Barclays, Lynda Gratton from the London Business School, Pearce from Mercer, and Gog Soon-Joo from SkillsFuture Singapore. Let's start off by a little bit of context, a little bit of scene setting, everyone. And I'll start with you, Christian, because there are so many uncertainties in 2023. We're still recovering from the pandemic. There are conflicts, from Ukraine to Sudan. We have a refugee crisis. We have a cost of living crisis. We have this crazy high inflation. But there is one sure certainty, and that's that we're all going to live decades longer. So give us an overview of what that's going to mean for global growth in the near term.
Well, okay, first of all, I think it's a very valid point you make. We are in a time where we look a lot of the crises that hit us, right? And everything is unprecedented, unpredictable. And so we stumble from crisis to crisis, and we sometimes lose sight of things that are actually quite predictable. And, climate change is one, but even more predictable in terms of knowing what we're going to see in the next decade is really demographics. And it's something that we like to talk about, but then whenever something happens, we say, well, we can push it off, right? And we are actually at the moment at a pretty critical juncture. Our calculations are, for example, that the Chinese population actually next year may start already falling in absolute terms. We now, if you go to Europe, Germany, for example, there's now actually around this time now a kink where there are less and less people entering the labor market. We have obviously a lot going on in France where we see protests against increasing the lives or working lives. And it's something that is never relevant immediately in the short term because demographics does work over decades, but it's very dangerous to always pushing it off because there's always some crisis. And the fact that we have massive social unrest in France over increasing the retirement age by 2 years shows you what Europe in a way has to look at as it needs to prepare its populations for that they're aging and maybe some of the generous pension schemes cannot be sustained. I know that a lot of analysts are looking at China and wonder whether they need to start correcting their forecasts for some of the earnings forecasts for companies because population is now in a very dramatic way, by the way. I don't think this is always recognized. In a very, very dramatic way, China's demographics is going to change. That a population boom really in the early 60s and until the end 70s, when they started the one child policy. So then they dramatically changed, and now you have all these people retiring, which is a large group, but you have no one coming. So they are doing something now that the rest of the world will experience, but in a very drastic way. So maybe one more point. So longer term growth will be affected because if you have less population growth, automatically your global GDP numbers will be less. GDP per capita can still be good. And second, and I'll stop with this, is we have amassed a lot of debt. So, over the last 40 years, population stopped growing as quickly. But at the same time, over the last 40 years, we amassed a lot of debt. And that means that now a much smaller coming generation does not only have to pay for the elderly, but also deal with this debt burden that was amassed over the last 40 years.
And that's true. There are fewer people in the workforce paying per retiree. I wonder that looking at this demographic transformation that's taking place, there are going to be some positives, there will be some negative impacts on the global workforce. Lynda, what do you think?
It's actually China that is the next country up because these are demographic changes which will affect every single country. What does that mean? Well, I was fortunate because I talk about work and how it means to work. But my colleague, Andrew Scott, an economist, worked out how long you would have to work if you had the sort of savings that most of us have. And that figure is 72 years. And so actually one of the things I decided to do was to work till 72. And I'll tell you how that goes in a couple of years' time. But then what happens is once you say, well, I'm going to work till 72, how do you feel about that? And of course, in Singapore, that's exactly what you're now talking to your citizens about. Everyone says, well, I can't possibly have the traditional full-time education, full-time work, full-time retirement, because you can't retire at 60 and live to 90. Well, apart from the financial aspect of it, how does it feel just from a social relationship aspect? So then we began to talk about something that's become quite important, actually, the idea that you need a multi-stage life. You need a life where you move in and out of different types of work at different stages, much more individualized. The 3-stage life is very much around age cohorts. You know, if you knew somebody's age, you knew what stage of life they were at. But this is more individualized, and that means from a psychological perspective, people need more insight, and that's the work that you're doing in Singapore and we're doing in the UK, actually, to give people insight from about their 50s on about what sort of life would you like, you know, what would it look like, what would you want to do, how much do you save, how much do you want to give back to the community, and so on. Let me just say a couple of points about that. What we found, and I'm a member of a research group in the UK who are looking at this in detail, is that the over 50s did not come back to work after the pandemic. And that's incredibly worrying for all of us, because once they don't come back at 50, they don't work. So we know now why they didn't come back. They didn't come back, and this is work from the Phoenix Institute, of which I'm a member. 3 reasons. Number 1, they were ill. And that says something about the health system, and I know you and I have just spoken about that in Singapore, which is very much more focused on health than it is on illness. Number 2, they're looking after somebody, they're caring for somebody, which actually in some cases is a grandchild. It's not always an aged parent. Number 3, and this is particularly so in the UK, they don't like their job. So this really also plays into the whole issue that we've been focusing in the WEF on, which is good work. One more thing to say, though, about that group. Let's say at 50 you wanted to find a new job. So you applied for a job, you know, pretty well qualified. What then happens in that process? Well, what we know happens is that you are discriminated against. We have absolute data on this. That in fact, I have said publicly before, I'll say it again, that age discrimination is worse, in my view, and I speak as a woman, than gender discrimination. Horrible stereotypes about what 50-year-olds are like, and what 60-year-olds are like, and what 70-year-olds are like. So the point I would like to make in this panel today is this is a multi-stakeholder issue. You know, governments have to move, individuals have to move, but importantly, corporations have to move. And there are not enough of you. In fact, there are very few of you who are actively trying to retain and to bring in the over 50s. So my plea to you is, if we want to get over this enormous crisis which we've described, you have got to start actively employing people over the age of 50.
I want to talk about the corporate side of things in a moment, but you were bringing in Soon-Joo, so I want to talk to you because there are different approaches, aren't there, from country to country, from region to region. So tell us about what is happening in Singapore and the measures that are being put in place to address the ageing population.
Sure, yes. We are very cognizant of the ageing populations, and we're taking really important steps. So I'll just highlight 3 key points. Redefining healthcare, not to treat people when they're sick, but now we are moving into healthier SG. Healthier Singapore means we have to take care of our health ahead of time, and that means we not just have long lifespans, but long and healthy lifespans. I think that about the total wellness. So focusing a lot on shifting from sick care to healthcare, real healthcare and well-being. So that's number 1, redefining healthcare. Number 2 is about redefining lifelong learning. So we invest in our people, in giving everybody $500 skill future credit from 25 and above. So as long as you're alive, you have the credits. And then from time to time, we see the consumption, we may top up again. I think that allowed people to take charge of how they want to see learning, how they want to readjust the kind of job role they are into something else. So the kind of adjacency, how they move across, so the lifelong learning will allow them to move in tandem of their life stages in terms of career. I think the third part of readjustment, I would say, is about redesigning workplaces to help people stay longer. So we have some success story among Singapore companies like our Sets Kitchen, which is the catering kitchens in the Changi Airport. They redesigned the whole workplace so that their 70-year-old can continue to stay in the job. Instead of asking them to carry heavy crates of potato, there's a robot that follows them. So the robots will carry the potato to the right place and then unload it, and they can continue to do the work.
So the companies are adapting their workforces to accommodate the older population. But I wonder if it's sort of feeling as they go, or whether it's something that's now becoming more ingrained in the way they do business. I mean, Graham, let's bring you in. I mean, are companies listening? I mean, have retirement systems and setups and pensions changed in line with this demographic transformation?
Not yet, is what I would say. So if we went back a few decades, we had, in the developed world at least, a predominance of defined benefit pension plans. And what I mean by that is that people were promised a set amount of retirement income, usually linked to salary, that gave them an adequate retirement income after a full career. Gradually, due to more tight funding regulations, which created more cash volatility for sponsoring employers, and also accounting standards that required those assets and liabilities to be marked to market at regular intervals, that caused tremendous volatility of financing of those plans and has pushed virtually all companies in the private sector towards what we call defined contribution plans, which is where you pay a set amount of contribution into a pension plan each year, and then the individual typically is responsible for managing that and choosing how it's invested, and ultimately the benefits that will be provided are just what that pot of money provides when you need to take it. So you've moved away from this, what's almost like an insurance of an adequate retirement income, into something where your retirement income is just going to depend upon how much you've saved up and the financial conditions at the point at which you retire. So there's a lot more volatility in that. Much more recently, we've seen some of the more progressive companies starting to think about introducing minimum standards. So we've seen the talking about living wage and looking at how much you actually need to earn in order to be able to live, to provide basic level of income to live adequately, or you could set that at a different level to maybe allow you more freedoms, the ability to eat out, the ability to go on holidays, for example. So companies will look at the different levels of income needed and try to target a living wage. Some companies are now looking at living pensions as being a target. That, I think, at the moment at least, is proving challenging, because the one thing that everybody underestimates is the cost of providing an adequate retirement income. And if you think about what we've just discussed here, if you're going to work for 35 years, say, or 40 years, and be in retirement for 35 or 40 years, and you earn on your investments, manage to keep your investment up with real salary growth, if you're paying in for the same amount of time as you're going to be taking money out, actually, if you pay 5% of your salary into a pension, you can expect to get a retirement pension of 5% of your final salary, which is probably a lot lower than what people think they're going to get from that money. And that's a ticking time bomb, when we talked about time bombs before, that I think is yet to be addressed.
So, and there's a resistance, isn't there, in many places to having to work longer, even though, because we're living longer, might be living healthier lives, with companies and governments focusing more on well-being. That might make us feel we need to work. But if we see what's happening in France, I mean, great example, they want to nudge up the retirement age from 62 to 64, and the workforce aren't having any of it.
Something I looked up, because on the question on France, is just, one has to just realize life expectancy. This is a global number. Imagine this is a number that includes developing countries and everyone. Life expectancy, according to the UN, at the 1950 was 46 years average. 2022, 71. So now over that time span, it was 70 years. We increased it from 46 to 71, and at the same time, the the retirement ages almost barely moved, and now we're fighting over 2 years. And now, look, I don't want to get into the nitty-gritty and whether the way Macron did it, this is not the subject here. But the fact is, and in particular in Europe, and in particular I think in older societies, that includes probably Japan, there needs to be a social dialogue. If we continue by governments just trying each year to do something about lifting the age or so, and then the entire working, not the entire working population, but those who are, unionized, etc., just fighting against, that won't work, right? I think there really needs to be an engagement where one rethinks how one thinks about this. Maybe work patterns need to change. Lifelong learning, maybe also that people, they maybe cannot be expected to do the same job when they get older, even if they are healthy. But maybe we need to think of that careers peak, but then there's nothing dishonor about it to continue to working, but no longer in that top job.
So, Graham, we're talking here about how important it is to adapt policies and rewrite the system. All of this makes sense on paper. So how do you then get that everyone mobilised to do something about it rather than just talk about the problem?
Well, I think at the end of the day, whether you talk about governments or whether you talk about private corporations, it's all about the business case. So companies are going to do this. They're going to invest in keeping workers productive for longer if they can see a return on it. And maybe for exactly the reasons that Christian's just outlined about the fact that in so many countries we're going to see far fewer people entering the workforce in the next few years, maybe that will provide the drive for companies to actually invest much more heavily and really make a difference in actually keeping people for longer and making sure that the jobs can be adapted to suit what people aged over 50 are looking for. Because as you said, Lynda, too many people are leaving the workforce because they actually don't feel that they can cope well in the environment that they find themselves in.
There have been some pilot schemes, though, haven't there? I mean, maybe you can talk us through some of these with some companies that are not sitting still, that are changing the factory floor.
Most companies are sitting still. I mean, honestly, it was interesting. I talked to a very, very smart CHRO this morning who said to me, it's very obvious, Lynda, that within the next 5 years, we will have a major skill shortage in the Europe. And I said, have you thought about the over 50s? He said, no. Well,
which companies are focusing on the over 50s? Have you got some examples in Singapore? Have we got some examples in Europe?
I mean, I could give you examples, and they're the same old examples. BMW have changed their factory so that it can accommodate people over the age of 50. Quite a lot of retailers actually are beginning to work with the over 50s because, clearly when everyone ages, your consumers age, and consumers would like, if you walk into a B&Q store, which is one of the sort of stores in Europe, which sells, DIY stuff, you'd like to potentially to have somebody of your own age giving you advice. So retail has been pretty good, actually. Manufacturing has been pretty good. Professional service firms have done very little, I think, although they are saying they are. I really am being honest here because I'm a academic, so it's easy for me to say what I see, really. And what I observe is, frankly, we're just not doing enough. We're not doing enough. And we need to do governments need to do what Singapore has done, and companies need to completely re-evaluate their whole talent pipeline and ask themselves, are we discriminating against people over the age of 50? It may be actually, by the way, that governments move on this. Governments might decide that that discrimination against age is as bad as discrimination against gender. In which case, there'll be a whole slew of regulations which companies will have to start thinking about. I'm not sure if it will get to that, but I wouldn't be surprised. So there's a lot to be done. This is just the beginning of this conversation.
Do you think that your global economic outlook might change if there were some big strides made, from government, from industry, from academia to come up with a gear shift, a joined-up framework here?
I think the immediate change would take place really through labour markets. You mentioned it. Right now, what we all economists are stunned about, and which has a big impact on inflation, by the way, because the wages are driven up by not enough supply. And there are many people who could be working and they're not working, and we need to find out why. If they enter the labor force, you have more labor working, probably on average at less wages, which sounds bad, but it's actually not a bad thing, because if more people working, the wage bill overall goes up, but you don't have the inflation pressure. That would have an impact on the outlook, even in the short term, if it was to happen over the short term, yeah.
One of the reasons that Lynda mentioned was because some people might be caring for others younger or older, which makes me think about healthcare systems. They need a shake-up too.
Well, interestingly enough, one of the recommendations that the Arbe report on the 100-year life came up with was childcare. And you'd think, well, what's childcare got to do with a 100-year life? Well, it was actually to take caring responsibilities from women, because in Japan, they wanted to get women into the workforce, which they've pretty much done, actually. But you're right. I mean, actually, it's a complex set of issues. Can I just mention one other point which we haven't talked about yet, and it's really fundamental, which is one of the reasons why it's difficult to say that the pension age should be 67, let's say, or 68, is that as people age, the variance within the age cohort increases. So, a 60-year-old, the variance within 60-year-olds is very, very wide. And as they age, it gets wider and wider and wider. And that's why it's so difficult to make one judgment about a 67-year-old, because you could be a 67-year-old running a marathon, or you could be a 67-year-old who's struggling to stand up. And that's why, it's so hard for a government to say it should all be 67. And so pensions, and this is the complexity of pensions really, has to somehow acknowledge that there will be, within any society, a number of 67-year-olds who actually can't work.
There's not one size fits all. That's certainly what I'm getting here. So I just wonder, in terms of what you'd like to see, in terms of public policy, in terms of what policymakers can do to address all of these changes that are happening in society, in the workforce, and in the makeup of the population.
Yeah, in Singapore, we already implemented the re-employment scheme, whereby when individuals reach so-called the pseudo-retirement age, companies are obliged to issue contracts on an annual basis, and the job can be redesigned to something else. You need not go back to the same jobs. So that allowed the flexibility on both ends, the employees and the employer, to decide what is the best deal for both. I think this should continue, definitely, for sure. In terms of the ageism, so-called the ageism, I would think that perhaps sometime this ageism concept is a kind of convenient excuse, because it will take a lot more efforts for line manager and HR, human resource manager, to rethink how to take advantage of this demographic premium. I call it premium. It's not a tsunami. That demographic premium, because they are experienced, they have the deep knowledge. But how do we take advantage of this demographic premium and to rethink, how can I design work, take advantage? It can be, I don't need you to drive the trucks, but can I get you to train someone else, do something, because you have the in-depth knowledge.
I absolutely agree. As I say, it's all about trying to keep people productive for longer. That will produce a greater amount of income for the economies that we're representing here. And what we need to also do is realise that we can't carry on with this idea of a fixed retirement age and a retirement income from that point, to expect to have enough for everybody at that point onwards. That we have to recognise the diversity. We have to recognise that there will be some people forced to retire much earlier due to ill health or due to the nature of their job, or a combination of them both, that will need support earlier. And there'll be some people who can actually afford to provide for themselves for much longer and save up, and may need a lot less assistance.
I want to go around the panel, because taking in all of the things we've said here, and just think, gosh, if you could go back in time and give advice to your 20-year-old self, what would it be in terms of preparing maybe yourself for retirement, or maybe becoming a campaigner, or maybe trying to set some steps in motion? Now, I know you said you think that people at school should learn more about annuities and know more about personal finance. What would you tell your 20-year-old self, Christian?
Know the simplest math of, interest, compound interest, and annuities maybe a bit far, but like have an idea of those concepts. The power of time, I think that's important, and aging is about time, right? What compounding does, I think that's one. And second, when I hear about the differences, the variance of how people, in what shape people are when they get old. I mean, a lot of this is determined at a young age, right? So I will not become like giving it health advice here, but I will tell my children to be careful, that health is not something to think about only in your 20s, and you can do a lot, but a lot of the things that people suffer later are probably often have to do, if they're not genetics, with how they live at the younger age. And I think there's a growing realization of that already among the younger.
So become financially literate, but also focus on that well-being before it's maintenance, or rather than repair work that's going on. Lynda, how about you?
Well, I would like Christian. I would talk about time, and I think when you're young, it's very hard to imagine that you have a whole life ahead of you, and that you can actually move time around. You don't have to do everything all at once. And the idea that you could actually take bits of what you want to do and be and move them forward or even move them back. So what I certainly do with my MBA students is help them think about their whole timeline. And obviously try and find work that they love. Because if you love what you do, then you're more likely to carry on wanting to learn, because being a lifelong learner is just such an important part of having a good life.
And what did you think you do? I mean, if you're thinking too that people in government and organisations are trying to deal with the now, and changing things for the future isn't necessarily top of the list.
I thought it's quite important that we talk about from young, at 20, we know about financial literacy, invest for our future, our well-being literacy. And I thought there's one more thing that today not every one of us are aware of, is the skills literacy. Is what do we have as we go around participating in activities. It can be school sports, it can be something competition, it can be things that we like to do, but what is that accumulated skills literacy? So it's like you just imagine we have a Lego bricks, we keep accumulating Lego bricks, but today we need to make it more evident and more aware of this skill literacy so that we can always reassemble ourselves for different parts of life. So I would add on skill literacy as an important thing.
Well, I'd like to say thank you to our audience, thank you to everybody who's taken part, and thank you very much to our panel. So much to talk about. Yeah. I think these conversations are going to disappear into the corridors of power, and we'll be continuing this for much longer.
Thank you.
Christian, Graham, Lynda, and Soon-Joo, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to this edition of the Agenda podcast. Do join me next week when we'll be looking at why the global gender gap appears to be getting even wider. Remember, you can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also find more agenda content on CGTN Europe's Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Telegram, and YouTube channels. Until next time, goodbye.
The most interesting questions.
Are there other living beings beyond Earth?
Will man or machine be in charge?
Great question.
Always have more than one answer.
Well, hold on, let me just draw up a list.
And always come from more than one person.
That's where the credibility lies.
The concept of having a machinery which is alive and evolving didn't wait for us.
The end of inequality of incomes and wealth around the world, can you imagine how difficult that is at the moment to achieve?
Every episode, Stephen Cole, Murray Beveridge, and some of the brightest minds out there shed light on the answers to some of the most intriguing questions.
There are two ways of looking at this.
Machines can't really discriminate between civilian and military targets.
The Answers Project.
Maybe we need to just look at this in a bit more detail.
Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
The Answers Project, a new podcast from CGTN Europe.